Everyone is speaking out about this. After the Islanders started the season 0-3, fans are really frustrated, and a lot of them are calling for younger players to take the place of veterans who are not performing good enough for the New York Islanders. And we're going to discuss this on this episode of Islanders Digest because while I get the frustration, while a lot of the veterans on this team have not looked good at all, I don't think it's time to really fully embrace the youth movement in the sense of bringing all the young kids up right away. I think there is a lot of value to having players develop in the AHL, and that might not be the most popular opinion. I might be going against the grain here, but I'm going to explain why on this episode of Islanders Digest. And I'd love to know what your thoughts are on these players, such as Calum Ritchie, Isaiah George, even Marshal Warren not playing in the NHL, especially with how the defense has looked for the New York Islanders. I'd love to know your thoughts on whether you think they should be playing the lineup, and if so, where they should be playing. But first, let's talk about Calum Ritchie, because he was the last player to be sent down to the AHL. We did not talk about it the other day, just because there was so many lineup things going on, so much excitement with Mathew Schaefer. But Calum Ritchie, after recovering from his injury, he practiced a few days with the Islanders before they ultimately sent him down. And I think the fact they kept him up a few days to get one more practice before sending him down really shows you what Patrick Waugh and the Islanders organization think of this player. And that's the first thing I want to highlight. Calum Ritchie not making the Islanders is not a failure. This does not change the context of the Brock Nelson trade. This does not change the context of how good of a prospect he is. In fact, the fact that he stayed up as long as he did and looked so good really makes it This is really encouraging, and while I had no concerns about Calum Ritchie, I feel like I'm reinforced in thinking that he is a top 6 center, caliber center in the NHL, which is exactly what the Islanders need. However, I also want to say there's nothing wrong with him playing in the AHL, and in fact, it's probably better for his career long term that he's playing in the role that he's going to be playing for in the future of the Islanders. As much as I think that he definitely could beat out a player like Casey Ziquez for a 4th line role, and you could make the argument that it actually would be beneficial for him playing as a 3rd line center to start his career, long term, this is going to be a top 6 player, and you want them playing top 6 minutes, which is why the AHL is currently the perfect place for Calum Ritchie to play. And keep in mind, considering how young Calum Ritchie is, he is not a player where playing in the AHL is going to hurt his development. In fact, I think it's very rare, if ever, that the AHL can hurt a player's development. He's a player, this is the highest level of hockey he has ever played. Other than those games in the preseason, even that's preseason, it's not a regular season game. This AHL hockey is a huge step up from the OHL, and it might be better for Calum Ritchie to take it as a stepping stone rather than being thrown right into the NHL, where perhaps some of his offense will be suppressed. As Patrick Waugh said recently, he's going to probably be the number 1 center, and yes, he is going to be the number 1 center. Patrick Waugh can't officially say that, but I'd be stunned if he is not the first line center for the Bridgeport Islanders, especially considering who is down there. But going back to the quote, he says he's going to play big minutes. He's going to play PK, power play. We are so impressed with him and so happy with the way he played in training camp, so I think it's going to be just good for him. Calum Ritchie made a really strong case to make the Islanders. I think that's why a lot of Islander fans are frustrated. But it's also important not to rush these kids, not have them be so important right away. For prospects like Schaefer, sometimes the jump to NHL level minutes is not too jarring. But for other prospects, sometimes it can be difficult. And one of the biggest failures we've seen with NHL teams that fail to develop talent, I think you can actually look across the pond at the New York Rangers, and what they consistently do is they take players who are high-quality prospects, who are likely going to be playing in the top 6 if they hit what they're supposed to be in the NHL, and they start them in these 3rd and 4th line roles, and that's just not the same game. While it's still impressive to play the NHL in those roles, and it's at some point it is valuable to get that experience depending on where you are. For a 20-year-old prospect like Calum Ritchie, it doesn't really make sense for him to start playing like a 3rd or 4th liner when ultimately he's going to be the 1st or 2nd line center for the New York Islanders. That's why he was in that Brock Nelson deal. That's what the Islanders believe he is. So it makes more sense for him to be playing those minutes in the AHL, where he's getting 20 minutes a night, where he's on the power play, where he's getting more comfortable on the penalty kill, because this is something that is a part of his game that maybe he would not be good enough to do with the Islanders at the start. And most importantly, In the AHL, he's playing center. Because the Islanders, you can make a good argument that perhaps Calum Ritchie can play as Bo Horvat's winger right now. In fact, that would probably improve our first line, if we're being completely honest. He could probably play with Mathew Barzal, even though I think they're a little too similar to work, and still improve that line, because the Lions have really been iffy this season. But ultimately, you want him developing in the role that he is going to play. And considering that the Pageau trade is coming eventually, it makes perfect sense for him to play in the AHL, hopefully dominate, and I believe he is going to dominate in the AHL. While I think the step up to the NHL would have been a lot for him to handle, I think he has, the way his skills translate, I think he's going to have a really good AHL season. It makes sense for him to play that time in his role before eventually JG Pageau gets traded, and then he learns to play in the NHL, perhaps playing a little less minutes when he's a third line center. But then keep in mind, he already had the first half of the season playing in the AHL, getting those meaningful minutes and continuing to explore his offense in a pro level, which is what you want to see. Now, there are other players a lot of fans are talking about. This is a tweet from Ryan B, and he has said something that we talked a little bit about in the last video, talking about that disaster of a game against Winnipeg, which is, I would like to see Isaiah George. He says, I too would like to see how Isaiah George would handle being on his offside. And I don't think Isaiah George will have any issue playing on his right side. In fact, I imagine for the Bridgeport Islanders this season, he's going to be experimenting with that a lot, because for the long-term future of the team, it makes a lot of sense, especially for a defenseman like Isaiah George, who is so sound defensively. We talk a lot about Isaiah George because he showed flashes of offensive potential last season, but people seem to forget this is a defenseman who's kind of in the mold of an Adam Pelech type player who is very sound defensively, and I think he can make that transition to be a really effective right side defenseman as a left-handed player. I think he has the tools for that. But I don't think it makes sense to throw Isaiah George into the NHL right now. Isaiah George is a player who was drafted in the same draft of Calum Ritchie. He is a very young player. He's really impressed when it comes to what he's been able to do so far in the pro level. As a result, I think it makes sense for Isaiah George to really spend more time playing a full AHL season. Remember, because he was called up to the Islanders last year because they needed so much help defensively, he never got to play a full pro year, and when he was playing in the AHL, the Bridgeport Islanders were such a disaster that it was not the best environment for him to be developing. I think it makes a lot of sense for the Islanders to take time and make sure Isaiah George is fully ready when he eventually makes the jump, which I believe he's going to. Actually believe he was drafted in the year before Calum Ritchie. Apologize for that mistake there. But my point is, this is a very young player, only 21 years old. If Isaiah George was 22 or 23, I would actually maybe be making the argument that perhaps it is time for him to get called up to the NHL and see what he can do. But because he's so young, I'm going to err on the side of caution, patience, really allow him to develop. That way, the next time he comes up to the NHL, he's able to stick. Because Isaiah George is a very intriguing prospect to me, and he's somebody who I think could be a huge part of this future, especially if he can play on that right side. Now, I know the defense has been an absolute disaster for the New York Islanders, but I just don't think the answer right now is to throw a rookie into it and just have the expectation for Isaiah George and Matthew Schaefer to carry this defense. I think that's completely unfair. There is another player, though, playing in Bridgeport who I will mention as a potential sooner solution, someone who's a bit older, and therefore it might make more sense to see what they have at the NHL level, and that is Marshal Warren, who is a player who we really weren't talking about at all last season. He was just an AHL guy, but he had a really strong training camp, really strong preseason that I think opened a lot of people's eyes, including mine, and then he is off to a hot start for the Bridgeport Islanders in the AHL. In 2 games, he has 4 points, and this is not a guy who is a very offensive defenseman, though he also put up points in the preseason for the Islanders. I think this might be a sign that Marshal Warren might be outperforming what the expectations for him were. He's 24 years old, and as a result of that, and the fact that he's already played a full season in the AHL, If the defensive problems get any worse for the Islanders, I would not be opposed to perhaps seeing what Marshal Warren can do at the NHL level. While I love having him down at Bridgeport, I think he really helps them be a more competitive team. In fact, early on, one of the reasons why I'm so comfortable with these players playing in Bridgeport is early on, Rocky Thompson has done a great job. Yes, they've only played 2 games, but they've won 1 at home, and they've also lost 1 in overtime. And that's really impressive when you consider last year Bridgeport won a grand total of, I kid you not, 4 games at home. It was a disaster. It doesn't take much to be better than what that team was last season, but it's clear that things have changed in the AHL for the Islanders. As a result, it seems like a place where players can go down and develop, while in the past it has been kind of a black hole where prospects went there and you never heard of them again. But let me know what you think about this, what you think about Calum Ritchie playing in the AHL. Are you disappointed he didn't make the Islanders? And what do you think of my idea for the Islanders to potentially bring up Marshal Warren? I'd actually argue if there are injuries, Marshal Warren might actually be ahead of Isaiah George as the first call-up for the New York Islanders. And I don't hate this. I don't even think this is a knock against Isaiah George, especially considering their ages. I think it's just showing that this player has been very impressive. And keep in mind, too, I don't know if throwing a rookie in is the best solution for the Islanders defense. Before they take this step, I would really like to see what Adam Boqvist can do. He had some good stretches last season. Wouldn't want to play Adam Boqvist with Schaefer, but if you move the pairs around, I'd like to see maybe Adam Boqvist play a game on the right side, because the right side has been a disaster for the New York Islanders. But if that doesn't work, I would not be surprised if eventually they consider giving a Marshal Warren a look, and perhaps Marshal Warren gets into this NHL lineup before an Isaiah George or even a Calum Ritchie. But I'd love to know your thoughts on that in the comments below. As always, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us so much as we continue to put out Islanders content every single day. I'm your host, Patrick Nilan. Catch you on the next episode of Islanders Digest. Let's go, Islanders. Hopefully we get a win against Edmonton this Thursday.